Thank you for having me, and I'm going to take a little different scope in my presentation and talk about certification of the aircraft and some of the standards work that is taking place toward that end. Next slide, please. In ASTM, we have several committees that are working specifically on UAM, AAM, and eVTOL aircraft. As you can see here, F-37 is on light sport aircraft, F-38 is on unmanned aircraft systems, F-39 on aircraft systems, F-44 on general aviation aircraft, and F-46 on aerospace personnel. These are all committees that are aviation specific, and each one of them has some components that include eVTOL related standards. There are also some other ASTM committees that have some work that crosses over into that area as well, but they're more on the side. So these committees have been working for some time. In the case of the first one, F-37, it was established now 20 years ago. And since then, we've had the other committees be established to help develop means of compliance to new performance-based regulations in the US and abroad. Both F-39 and F-46 support those efforts. These committees are now jointly discussing how to share the activity, because we're beginning to have some crossover between each of the committees. I'm going to focus in on the specific aspects out of F-44 on eVTOL, where there were gaps in the standards. Next slide, please. So on the right is a list of standards that are being developed or modified to include areas where there is eVTOL specific language needed. So I won't read through them, but you can see there's a good number of them. And this is all under, mainly under F-44, general aviation aircraft. So F-44, its scope is the development and maintenance of standards and guidance materials intended to be acceptable means of compliance for general aviation aircraft rules and regulations around the world. It addresses the full spectrum of general aviation aircraft, and AC433, which is an administrative committee, it doesn't create standards, but it oversees this activity. It updates eVTOL related work items across all of the different committees. Next slide, please. So this advisory committee was formed when there was an interest in making sure that the ASTM standards covered the areas that would be applicable to eVTOL. So there was a gap analysis performed against the Part 23 for FAA and CS23 for EASA, needs of compliance, based on the new performance-based rules. And as you can see from the chart, the majority of standards that already exist covered what was needed for eVTOL. There were some that just weren't applicable, and there were some that needed some only minor changes, and there were just a few that needed major modification. So the focus then was on the list that we just saw of areas that needed to be created or modified. So there are a total of 23 work items, and this group, AC433, both helps facilitate the activities of each of those groups and then monitors that activity. And if there are new things that are discovered that need work, those will be added as well. So this group has regular meetings about every other month to have each of the working groups report out, and then that information is shared with the rest of industry and authorities. Next slide, please. So here's a more real example of an aircraft that would fit into this category. It happens to be the aircraft that my company, WISC, is developing. And you can see some of the areas that are being covered, such as fly-by-wire flight controls, distributed electric propulsion, electric engines, energy storage, etc. These are all things that require more than what we have today within the standards to be able to show means of compliance. Next slide, please. So with the development of the aircraft, as we've just heard about how to operate in the airspace, landing sites, there are many, many factors that need to be considered that are new and different than what we are traditionally used to in current aviation and operating in the airspace system. So we talk about this as an ecosystem for which there are a number of challenges. So I'm talking specifically about certification, so type certification, production approval, similar to legacy aircraft. But for these aircraft, we're going to, because we have some new areas to cover, we'll need to have special conditions, operational limitations. On the production approval side, some of the new technology will include additive manufacturing, high rate manufacturing. For airspace integration, especially as if we're talking about autonomous operations in the future, spectrum, C2 link, vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to ground communications, cybersecurity, uncooperative traffic and conspicuity, just being seen. On infrastructure, we just heard about vertiports. Charging is another one of those challenges. And then, of course, community engagement comes on top of all of that. So we need to have the local and city acceptance before we'll be able to operate in some areas. If we look at FAA and their expectations as this industry continues to develop, here's just a quick look at some of those. So in the short term, the expectation is that there will be a pilot on board and that most of the existing regulations will be met, particularly the operating limitations, that there will be minimal new technology in aircraft, and there'll be low rate production and operation. So if we look at those who are talking about entry into service in, say, 2024, this will probably be most like what we'll be seeing. In the medium term, we're going to see approval for more automated systems on board, potentially remote pilots and operators, a hybrid airspace system where we're working with the UTM concept and developing that into something where we can have the integration of those operations with legacy operations, therefore a hybrid airspace system. As the public gets used to seeing these, the expectation is the acceptance level will come up and more routes will be able to be established. But the ultimate objective is full autonomy, operations at scale, costs similar to high-end rideshare, and seamless airspace integration. So there are different approaches to this. Some of those who are wanting to enter into service sooner are looking at those short-term expectations. There are a few like Wisk that are looking at going straight to autonomy, which is certainly a challenge, but also just another opportunity there. Next slide, please. So ASTM has been very interested in autonomy and what that could entail to get there. So there was another administrative committee, 377, that was established to develop some documents, technical reports, to speak to this area, not create standards. Most say that's a little premature still. But so far there have been two publications, Autonomy, Design, and Operations in Aviation, focused mainly on terminology, and Developmental Pillars of Increased Autonomy for Aircraft. So these are guidance for those who are thinking about the subject and know that at some point standards will need to be developed. So these will be essentially resource guides to help them along. There is one more on the way. We're looking forward to it being published soon, Regulatory Barriers for Aviation Autonomy. And that is a look at some of the existing operational regulations, in particular Part 91, going line by line through the whole rule set and looking at if autonomy were to be implemented, what rules would have to be reviewed, potentially changed. So that will be an interesting something to read when it comes out. Next slide, please. Those who are in the industry are looking at this as a global industry, particularly the manufacturers on the aircraft side. So they want to encourage, wherever possible, harmonization between jurisdictions and authorities. So on the aircraft certification side, we already have, for those that are those eVTOLs that are that also fly on a wing, Part 23 for FAA and EASA CS23, that's what's being used as a certification basis. Use of industry consensus standards for means of compliance, common terminology. There I'll reference back to the technical report that has terminology in it that's very helpful to share. Alignment on aircraft categories. We have very traditional categories, airplanes, rotorcraft, etc. These aircraft fall somewhere in between, and there's a debate about what the best term is for that and potential category. So you probably heard of powered lift. That creates a lot of complexities. It's a very active discussion at the moment. Ability to certify at the aircraft level. So for FAA, for instance, you can certify an aircraft and the engine and propulsion system underneath that without having to have separate type certificates for each. And with the integration of systems with these aircraft, especially with distributed propulsion, we're going to see that more often than not, where the propellers and the propulsion systems are unique to that particular aircraft. Process for accepting new technology and innovation. This is really important. It's a big challenge to get acceptance of any new technology or someplace where the current rule set doesn't speak to it. And the process is something that there is concern about from the industry side about how long that will take. So that's something that is worth thinking about. And then on the operations side, mutual recognition of eVTOL pilot in command and operator certificates. So if we can get the aircraft certified, we also need to make sure that we have something similar for the operators, and so they don't have to have completely different qualifications everywhere they would fly. Although it's understood that different jurisdictions are going to have different rule sets to some degree. Qualification of personnel on new technology. F-46, for instance, deals with personnel, and they're trying to establish common guidance for what personnel would, what kind of metrics there would need to be for the training and testing of personnel, for instance, to do maintenance or repair for new technology. Accommodation for highly automated operations in airspace and at landing facilities. So there's a very active ASTM process on vertiports that talks about highly automated operations. This is another one where it will be important that there be some agreement as to how that should work. So the real message there is that with this activity, and I think it was said before in ASTM, it's both encouraged, and we're happy to see the amount of participation from groups globally, both from the industry and from the authorities. And then lastly, cross-border transit agreements. Hopefully, if we do a good job on the certification of the aircraft and the operations, we'll be able to cross borders, because that certainly will be important for the economy. Next slide, please. And with that, thank you. Look forward to the question and answer period.